Can y'all? Yeah, okay. I'd like to begin by addressing my title, Alpa Yankahpahkan Alpa, land is land for the worker. This is a quote I pulled directly from one of my interviews I conducted in the community of Pumamarca. And I think it really speaks to the way that people in that community and in my other case study look at their relationship to the land that they work. Alright, it's decided that he wants to play. That's okay. So, sure? I think that's fine. Okay, sorry about that. So, beginning with a quick overview of the presentation, we're going to start with a literature review, followed by some quick historical context, then going deeper into the two case studies, Maras and Pumamarca, and finishing up with a conclusion. So the three main books my thesis is in dialogue with are The Tourism Encounter by Florence Babb, a very interesting book that talks about post-conflict countries and how that shapes their tourism development. There's also, of course, Making Machu Picchu by Dr. Mark Rice, one of the only and the best works I've seen about the historical development of Cusco's tourism industry. And finally, Land Without Masteries by Ana Kant, a landmark work on the Peruvian agrarian reform that really shows how the agrarian reform allowed community members to develop agency in ways to combat the state in ways that they hadn't before. So, beginning with the historical context, I mentioned before the agrarian reform was very important in Peru's modern development. In 1968, there was a military coup led by General Juan Velasco Alvarado, who overthrew the President Fernando Terry and installed a military regime. Now, unlike previous regimes in Peru's past and similar military regimes in the region, this one was markedly left-wing. It did not have sort of repressive attitude towards social movements, but instead sought to co-opt them and champion the causes of the people who were getting involved in resistance against the government. Namely, especially the figure of the campesino or the rural indigenous farm worker became central. And this government was the latest in many, trying to sort of bring them into the fold of the nation-state project, somewhat unsuccessfully, as we'll go on to see. Below that, I have a quote from a very famous speech given by Juan Velasco Alvarado. It says, "Campesino, el patrón ya no comerá más de tu pobreza," or "Campesino, the boss will no longer eat from your poverty." It really speaks to the type of rhetoric that the government tried to embody. This government would be replaced again by a civilian rule in 1980, and this same year would be the beginning of the armed internal conflict, a violent military campaign by the Maoist terrorist group Sendero Luminoso to overthrow the Peruvian state. So clearly there were many people among the rural indigenous communities who were still very malcontent with the state, did not feel like they had a stake in it. Then in 1990 came the election of President Alberto Fujimori, who enacted various neoliberal reforms that shaped Peru's economy, giving it the character that it has to this day. And finally, importantly for the tourism sector, in 2007, the New World Wonders Foundation released its final list of 7 world wonders, and this really put Machu Picchu on the map, so to say, and really led to a spike in the number of visitors coming to Cusco and to Peru in general. So going into the case studies, first we have the town of Maras. This is a town in the area known as the Sacred Valley, a little bit outside Cusco, and that's really the heart of the main tourism sector. It's on the way to Machu Picchu, and is home to those very beautiful salt flats you can see right here that are the principal touristic attraction that drive people to visit. The salt mines have been historically harvested from pre-Columbian times, so that's centuries, if not millennia, that the local indigenous people have been harvesting the salt and maintaining the salt flats. And during the military regime, this changed, and they tried to nationalize the salt flats, but this was resisted by the community. And once the regime was gone in 1980, they organized themselves into a strike and then marched all the way to the regional capital of Cusco to change the corporation that administered the salt flats from being a national corporation to a municipal corporation. This way they could have a lot more control by winning in local elections over how the corporation was managed. And this was all well and good, especially after the tourism boom in the 90s and especially after 2007. They were able to sell their salt to tourists. It has a very pretty pink hue, and also have tours, as you can see. So they very much entered into the tourism market. And it was only in the late 2010s that they ran into trouble with the national government, where the Ministry of Culture, through the National Institute of Culture, tried to expropriate the lands or basically restrict access to them. The issue was that they considered Maras to be an archaeological site, which it is, as I mentioned. It's been present the site of activity for hundreds of years. But by naming it a protected archaeological site, technically nobody can enter without the presence of an archaeologist. As you can see, that's not the case. The community has rejected this stance, and there's sort of a stalemate right now between the government and the community. Then we have the case of Pumamarca, the one I spoke of before, where the title of my thesis comes from. This community, at the center of it, has an old hacienda house that is also the center of the conflict between them and the regional Ministry of Culture. So this hacienda house is particular because it's not only an old colonial building, but it also has foundations made out of Incan masonry. And because of that, after the agrarian reform was carried out, after the people split up the land that they worked for themselves, they had a good relationship with the Ministry of Culture, relatively speaking. The Ministry of Culture would send an archaeologist or a preservationist to take care of the house, to make sure it was in good condition. But again, once the tourism began in the mid to late 2000s, all of a sudden there was a lot more interest in the site. And the government proposed several things to turn it into a tourist attraction, having the local people sell artworks and change the crops they harvest to cater more to tourists. They rejected this proposal, mainly because they didn't agree with the way that the revenue was split from the tourism income. So now again, there's a sort of a stalemate with the government threatening to expropriate the lands won by the community members during the 1969 agrarian reform, with the excuse that it has to protect the archaeological heritage of the nation. Meanwhile, the descendants of that supposed Inca legacy that we're trying to sell to the tourism industry are the ones sort of being pushed off of their land, as they have in the past by private interests. This is just a map of the city of Cusco that I wanted to show to you all. So Pumamarca is this sort of red blob you see up here. So you can see it's very, very close to the city. That's why it would be a very convenient stop to add to the tourism circuit. But as stated, the community members don't agree with that. And finally, the conclusions. So 3 main points I wanted to hit on. The first is, before the agrarian reform, one of the big points that it sought to combat was this idea of Inca sí, Indios no, right? The Peruvian nation state has always been very proud of its Incan legacy, while at the same time disenfranchising the modern indigenous communities that are descendants from those Incas. Then the 1969 agrarian reform, it did not change this, but what it did do is it gave communities tools to combat these unjust policies, ways to organize themselves, and to lead strikes, and to force concessions from the central government. And finally, the neoliberal era, which has been the latest chapter in Peru's economic and tourism development. It's been a double-edged sword. On the one hand, like I said, it's brought many more visitors, much more money, much more revenue. But as Mark Rice elegantly quotes in his book, once tourism becomes profitable enough, it's too profitable to leave to the locals. So now we see the government getting involved, and also in other cases, multinational corporations trying to get a slice of the pie that people have built for themselves. Thank you very much.